Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Introduction to Medieval Philosophy on the Philosophy Academy. In this video, what we're going to do is take an introduction to the subject of medieval philosophy, talk about some of the major issues in relation to studying medieval philosophy, and then outline the scope of this series of videos. This is the first lesson on the subject of the history of Western philosophy, or at least the next scene of Western philosophy, the next section of the topic. So far, we've been talking in our History of Western Philosophy series about ancient philosophy. We spent quite a lot of time talking about ancient philosophy. We explored the pre-Socratic era, people like Thales and Empedocles and people like Zeno, and then we moved on to looking at Socrates in quite a lot of detail, and then Plato, and then finished off with a little bit of Aristotle at the end. This lesson is going to then move away from the ancient tradition, the ancient Greeks, and then start to talk about the development of philosophy within the medieval period, within the early to mid medieval period. Now, I'm going to just begin by talking about one of the issues that is often had and often levied in relation to the study of medieval philosophy, or even medieval history, for that matter. One of the interesting things that we encounter, one of the interesting problems that we encounter, is the definition of medieval philosophy itself. It says Western philosophy, but I mean medieval philosophy itself. Because one of the problems that we have is that medieval philosophy has, or medieval history, or the concept of the medieval period, is not a clearly defined concept. There are not clearly defined limits as to where it begins and where it ends. According to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, anybody who is actually interested in philosophy or has any kind of or is studying philosophy should know about this website in a great amount of detail. Medieval philosophy is conventionally construed as the philosophy of Western Europe between the decline of the classical pagan culture and the Renaissance. So this is, generally speaking, the ways in which we define it, but even this isn't particularly limiting in terms of the beginnings and ends. There is no clear cut-off point in this, even in this passage, that clearly delineates between what is classical ancient philosophy and what is medieval, or what is medieval and what is early modern. And so, as a result of which, we are sort of looking at the contours of this subject with a little bit of suspicion, because you can really, in some cases, put some of the medieval philosophers into the very later period of the ancient philosophy, or you could even put the later medieval philosophers as the earliest starting of the new tradition of the early modern period. And so, as a result, we can think about philosophers who are definitely in the medieval period. You can talk about people like Aquinas, you can talk about people like Anselm of Canterbury, you can talk about the traditions that they really levied, the development and the interaction between philosophy and theology during this period. But what about people like Augustine? What about people who are towards the end of the medieval period? Where do they sit? Do they sit in the medieval philosophy, or do they sit in ancient or early modern? And so, as a result of which, we're essentially going to be limiting ourselves to what is conventionally described as medieval philosophy, rather than trying to be very precise in our definitions of where philosophy in the medieval period begins and ends. Generally speaking, when we talk about medieval philosophy, when we talk about medieval history, when we talk about this period in general, we're talking about a tradition of philosophy between the decline of the Greek and Roman empires on the one hand, and the beginnings of the early modern period and the Renaissance on the other hand. So there is sort of a gap between the decline of ancient Greece and ancient Rome and the beginnings of the Renaissance, and this sort of gap, this sort of middle period, is what we would describe as the medieval period, medieval philosophy. And that's what we're essentially going to do. And by decline, when we talk about the decline of the Roman Empire specifically, for example, we're not talking about the decline of the Roman Empire in its entirety. We're talking about the decline of the Western Roman Empire, because of course it moves to the east and becomes the Byzantine Empire. And this would, of course, last until the mid to I believe the mid 1400s. And so, as a result of which, we're not going to be covering that. We are going to be covering the period that would include Byzantine philosophy and Byzantine history. So with this in mind, the chronology is quite easy to in terms of being able to find where we're going to begin and where we're going to end, even if the true beginnings and endings of this period are not easy to clearly delineate. It's imprecision in how we clearly delineate these terms. Most historians and most philosophers of history and most historians of philosophy will date the beginning of the medieval period to in and around the works of St. Augustine of Hippo, who is the person who is cited and imaged on the screen here. And this is from around 354 to 430 AD. So as we see the decline of the Roman Empire, we start to see the development of, and one of the key characteristics of this period is the fact that we see the development of and the flourishing of Christianity, specifically within the Western world. We also see the flourishing as it stands of Islam as well in the Middle East and in parts of Africa within the medieval period. So these two religions will flourish, and we will talk about these two religions in a lot of detail in this series of lessons as well, because you can't really study medieval philosophy without reference to Christianity and Islam. This is also where we're going to begin our studies, though. We'll begin our studies with St. Augustine in 354 to 430 AD. And this takes us nicely to what the scope of this series of lessons is going to essentially cover. Now, it's been quite difficult to clearly define where we're going to begin and end, as I've spent a lot of this lesson talking about. And so it's been quite difficult to really put together a series of lessons that will be as both all-encompassing, as in it will have enough depth in terms of the knowledge and the information that we're going to provide, but also is good on the amount of breadth that we're talking about. We're talking about a period of history of a few hundred years, maybe even up to 1,000 years nearly. And so the result of which is that we have to be quite broad in terms of the detail in some cases. But I think that we've done a good job in establishing a good scope for this series of lessons. The first topic, as I've mentioned, will be the subject of Augustine. We'll talk about Augustine's philosophy, we'll talk about an introduction to Augustinian philosophy, his ethics, his philosophy of language, we'll talk about his interpretation of religion, and we'll talk about the relationship between philosophy and theology. We will then look to examining medieval philosophy post-Augustine. So this would mean an examination of people like Boethius, the Carolingian period. We'll also talk about Anselm of Canterbury and Maimonides. Okay, these are some of the major period philosophers, should I say, of this early medieval section. We would then move on to the sort of mid-medieval period, and this is really where we're going to talk about Aquinas on the one hand, and then we'll also talk about William of Ockham on the other hand. So the philosophy of St. Thomas Aquinas, the philosophy of William of Ockham, and then we'll talk about some of the other philosophers that sort of sit in and around this period as well, so we won't just limit ourselves to Aquinas and Ockham. But then the final topic is going to be one that I'm going to be really excited about, which is sort of looking at this, taking the chronology and then picking out some of the key themes within the chronology of this period of history, and specifically this period of the history of philosophy. So we'll talk about specifically the philosophy of the Islamic world as well as Jewish philosophy at points in this series as well as the relationship between philosophy and theology. You will notice that a lot of these philosophers that we're talking about, Aquinas, Occam, Augustine, Anselm, are all theologians. They are all church fathers in some cases. They're all saints. And so the result of this is that we have to think about the ways in which their philosophy interacted with the rise and the flourishing of Christianity. And then finally, we'll do a couple of lessons on the philosophy of religion in this period, namely Augustine, Aquinas, and Anselm, who developed their own arguments for the existence of God and developments for ideas relating to the problem of evil and conceptualizations about the Trinity and all these different kinds of things. And so we will just finish by touching on that in a little bit of detail at the end of this series.